Welcome, everyone. My name is Sue Harmon, and I'm a librarian at the Manchester City Library in Manchester, New Hampshire. Thank you for joining us today for the Queer Cinema talk presentation. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. All attendees are automatically muted to cut down on background noise. Please use the chat box for questions and make sure that all messages are going to everyone for messages that are meant for the whole group to read. Any messages sent to me privately will not be read aloud. This program is also being recorded for future viewing. I'll be putting a link to the survey in the chat window. Please follow that link at the end of the program to fill out a brief survey. Your responses really do help us. Let us know what types of programs you'd like to see in the future, and give us your email to sign up for our newsletter and all of our upcoming programs and library news. And speaking of upcoming programs, I just want to let everyone know about some that are coming up in the next couple weeks. On June 29th, we have the second part of our senior storytelling program led by Dr. Ed Mahoney of the Mental Health Center of Greater Manchester. Seniors 60 plus are invited to share their stories and listen to the fun and interesting memories of their peers. On July 13th, next month's adult craft is going to be available for pickup. This next month is Easy Macrame Plant Hangers, and the kits include all materials needed to complete the craft as well as instructions. July 15th is Bugs and Smelts. Our local fly fisherman, Rick Little, will share tales of fly fishing and talk about flies. And on August 3rd, An Artful Mystery is a story about the riveting, about how a lost treasure of the art world was discovered in a small town in New Jersey. You can sign up by going to www.manchesterlibrary.org and clicking on upcoming events to view calendar listings. And if you haven't yet signed up for our summer reading program, our adult program is running currently. We had our first raffle winner drawn today. You can sign up on our website, manchesterlibrary.org, and stay till the end of this program to get your code for 60 points if you're participating in the program. Without further ado, I will hand it over to our presenter today. Liz Ryan is a librarian at the Derry Public Library, and she's also a film scholar. And I'm going to stop my screen share and hand it over.
Well, thank you for the very flattering introduction. I've always just appreciate film nerd always works for me. I don't know what works for you, Jamie.
I would like to say that I'm a film historian, or just a dork.
My name is Liz Ryan. I'm a librarian down at the Derry Public Library. But I am a resident of Manchester. Hello, everyone. Hello, neighbors. Hello, Sue. I am someone who I have had both formal film classes on an academic level, but both prior to and after college, most of my film work has been self-guided. And this is actually where I would like to give a shout out to libraries, because the fact that my local library had books on film and had groundbreaking movies, sort of the movies that you should view to get a good groundwork for cinema, I was able to kind of self-guide my journey. And I think film is one of the easiest subjects to kind of learn on your own. I am an advocate of you don't necessarily have to go to get a formal education in it. It is helpful, but there are also a number of books, a number of movies, a number of documentaries, and now even on YouTube, there are people who are doing film education. All right. So I would also like to introduce my very good friend. We have known each other for, I believe, 10 years now. We met when I lived in Connecticut at a screening of The Room, and my partner Todd and I think the three of us just figured, yeah, we're all going to be very good friends. Jamie McConaughey.
Hi, I'm Jamie McConaughey. Last time around, I made a joke about how I was the token queer person, but I don't feel that's actually accurate, so I won't actually make that joke. I'm a trans woman from Darien, Connecticut. I actually came out a year ago to my partner, a year ago on Sunday. And I have studied film both academically and on my own. I've also been a on and off film critic. I've written for several publications, most notably The Mary Sue for about a year. And I currently mostly write for myself, most notably my, how would you frame it, unhinged project to review all of the X-Files in order?
Completist.
But I'm also very, very interested in films about queer people for reasons that are, I think, fairly obvious.
And I am as well. I grew up in a fairly waspy suburb area, but for me, prior to my oldest friend coming out to me in my senior year of high school, film and television, that was the only exposure I had really had to queer people. And I think film as a whole is and just I would say pop culture is a great way for people to see people they might not meet in real life. It's a good empathy tool in a way, because it actually asks you to empathize with someone that's not you.
And on my end, it was always just, I might talk about this a little bit more later, but I grew up in Alaska in the 1990s. And so the tiny little scraps you got of queer representation prior to what would you say, 2010, 2012, were always just incredibly valuable to me. For the longest time, my favorite character on Twin Peaks was Denise, for reasons that I would never really want to explain.
All right, well, we'll get started. I'm going to get there we are. And I'm just going to minimize this. So, queer cinema. We've introduced ourselves. I am Liz Ryan.
I'm Jamie McConaughey.
No relation to Matthew McConaughey.
Not that we know of. Don't say that on recording. I'm totally talented, Mr. Ripley-ing in.
All right. So what is queer cinema? This is the official term, or new queer cinema, was coined in 1992 by B. Ruby Rich to describe a new crop of queer films and creators. This was around the time that Gus Van Sant, Gregg Araki, Jenny Livingston were really breaking into, I wouldn't say mainstream Hollywood, but as mainstream as they had gotten at that point. One of the primary books that I utilized for this program was a book called Queer Images. And they discuss multiple ways to kind of answer the question of what is queer cinema. One of them is the characters are queer or queer coded, and put a pin on that term. We're going to get to it. The other is authorship. Is it written by someone, directed by someone, produced by a queer creator? However, that doesn't always mean it's going to be accepted by queer people. Jamie, you've brought up Ryan Murphy as an example of a queer creator, but you don't necessarily feel that all of his works are queer friendly.
I think that his works are often very queer friendly if you're a very specific kind of queer person, and if you're not, they are extremely unqueer friendly, and I will leave it at that.
Okay. Spectatorship, if it's watched by or aimed at a queer audience. And this doesn't necessarily mean it was made intentionally for queer people. A great example is the movie Valley of the Dolls with Patty Duke and Sharon Tate. That has a huge following with the older gay community, as does its unofficial sequel Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, although I would argue that was probably made for a queer audience. Genre, musical, that kind of ties into spectatorship. So musicals, sci-fi is a genre that is very queer friendly, mainly because a lot of that stuff can be coded in a way that couldn't be obvious in another film. And experience. Who is the movie asking you to empathize with? But for the sake of this program, films that deal with queer themes and or are by queer filmmakers is probably a good place to start. Again, this is a brief overview rather than really going into the nitty gritty, because there are certain segments of film, queer cinema, that we could spend 2 hours on.
Oh, easily.
So what does queer coded mean? The definition that I like is, quote, queer coded, as much as the name suggests, refers to a process by which characters in a piece of fictional media seem, or code, queer. This is usually determined by a series of characteristics that are traditionally associated with queerness, such as effeminate presentations by male characters or more masculine ones from female characters. These characters seem somehow less than straight, so we associate those characters with queerness, even if their sexual orientation is never a part of the story. And that was from Trisha Ennis. So a couple examples, I would say everyone in Interview with a Vampire. And I'm not kidding when I say this, pretty much any Disney villain from The Little Mermaid onward. Fun fact, the design for Ursula was inspired by the drag performer Divine. Look it up. There's Norman Bates in Psycho. That gets into a messier territory.
It very much does.
Interesting one, Plato with Rebel Without a Cause, because if you talk to certain people, it's not even coded, it's very upfront. But considering the film is made in the 50s.
I mean, the example I compare Plato to is what's her name from The Haunting of
Catherine
Hill.
Zeta-Jones's.
No.
Oh wait, no, not The Haunting.
The Haunting of Hill House. Yes.
Okay.
Her character in the original version. I mean, I recall Catherine Zeta-Jones briefly. But she was as explicit as they were allowed to make it at that moment in history, and so was Plato, according to most reads of the film.
Yeah. Peppermint Patty. I mean, not film, but she's someone
in films.
Oh, that's right. There have been penis movies. Xena, not film, but my goodness, if there's ever been a queer-coded television series, it's Xena. And kind of tying into the Norman Bates, very problematic archetype. There's Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs, which we will also speak about a little bit later in the program. But we're going to get into early cinema and queerness. So if anyone's watched my film programs at the Derry Public Library, one of my favorite things to talk about is sort of bust the idea that cinema has, for the most part, been just a straight white man's world. If you watched my program on Black directors, Oscar Michaud was making films back in the 1910s. Women directors, the first woman director, Alice Guy Blanche, was making films in the late 1800s. And just as with women and as with people of color, queer people and queerness has always been in cinema. In terms of performing arts, queerness goes way back. Probably in terms of what is considered like the earliest quote unquote queer film is a short called The Gay Brothers, and it doesn't explicitly feature homosexuality, but there's male intimacy, which 1895 was actually more culturally accepted at the time. It's become, by many people, they see it and they're like, well, I see myself in that. And like whether it was intended or not, it's been adopted. There is probably when I was reading through Queer Images, the most interesting film I read about was this 1914 film called A Florida Enchantment. A woman takes a magic pill. She starts growing facial hair. She starts wearing suits. She cuts her hair. She takes a female lover, takes a male name. What does that remind you of?
The other direction that I'm going?
Yes, the other. Well, yeah. So, and they actually do have a man go like, well, okay, I'm going to take the pill, and he wears a dress and he's chased by a mob. Unfortunately, things have not changed over 100 years later. And it is played for laughs, but the idea of, okay, gender bending has been something in cinema, and it's been in fiction for a while as well. There's a Wizard of Oz book that kind of has this idea of like, oh, you're actually Ozma, but you've been disguised as a boy, and now I can transform you into a girl.
We will talk. Oh, I could talk to you about Ozma, Liz.
Yeah. So again, just basically, I like to tell people this isn't new. A lot of people, when like to think like, oh, this just happened in the past 10 years. Not true. If anything, it was very present in early cinema, especially the teens and early 20s. And then society got a little bit more conservative. We stopped seeing those images. Very notably, German films were very open with like, okay, we have queer characters. The film, The Difference from Others, is, it's a gay romance. It's a bit sad, but it still exists. And then there's the movie Michael in 1924, which made an explicit call for gay rights in Germany. And interesting fact about Germany, pre-Nazi era had an institute, I believe translated to English, it was called the Institute for Sex Research.
Yeah.
And they studied people who were gay. They studied people who were transgender or just the idea of like cross-dressing, bisexualism, and they took notes, they recorded it. If you've ever seen pictures of Nazis burning books, there is a good chance that one of the books they're burning was from the Institute of Sex Research.
Yeah, Weimar Germany was much more liberated than America was at that particular moment in history. Just one of the problems with discussing cinema at that moment, because a lot of cinema prior to really the 1970s, a lot of it is lost, and I think like something like 80% of all films made before 1950 are just gone forever.
Yeah, unless you find them
in a salt mine in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
So odds are that there was actually a lot more queer cinema in Germany during that period, but we just don't know about it because the Nazis were not super big on that.
Yeah. Well, and you made, when we presented this in Derry, a very interesting point where people think that the getting rights and getting visibility is just it's a straight uphill trajectory.
It's never a straight uphill trajectory, and it's never just the way it goes in America. The comparison I love to make is that in Japan, homosexuality was only outlawed for 10 years during the Meiji Restoration, and that was only as part of their westernizing campaign.
Yeah. But I mean, if we want to look at Germany as an example, we had a very open society, and then all of those rights were taken away. And if you are familiar with the Holocaust, queer people were persecuted as well, the Pink Triangle. In the United States, we had, lesbian subplots in Pandora's Box. Patsy Kelly, who, if you are a horror fan, was Laura Louise in Rosemary's Baby. She was actually an out lesbian actress in the 1930s. There was Dorothy Arzner, one of the, I think in the 30s, the only female director working in Hollywood. She was kind of open secret.
I mean,
as open as it could be.
In that period of time, you could, especially in the 1930s and the 1920s, where things were a little more, everyone was drinking all the time.
Yes.
Like if you were rich and famous, Truman Capote is a really good example, you could get away with it. Or if you were really discreet, you could get away with it.
Yeah.
But
in earlier Hollywood, like 1930s Hollywood, there's a few other directors. George Cukor is one, where gay, and there were people who knew, but it was, or like Marlene Dietrich being bisexual, people knew, it just wasn't talked about.
Pre-Hays Code.
Yeah. You can actually go to Derry Public Library and go see my old presentation on film censorship, where I will talk about how awful the Hays Code was. And so actually post Hays Code, the only time you'd really see queer people featured was in exploitation films, which were, for the most part, cautionary tales such as Children of Loneliness. So we're going on to the 50s and 60s, or as I like to call baby queer cinema. So we're starting to see kind of a little resurgence in American cinema again. Ed Wood, who is known for very bad films like Plan 9 from Outer Space, Ed Wood himself was, I think at the very least, a crossdresser. He's no longer with us, so I don't know how he would identify himself.
I don't know how Ed Wood would identify. And one of the things that's sort of fascinating about him is that Glen or Glenda is a bad film. He's a bad filmmaker, and he made a bad film. But it is also, if you actually sit down and watch it and approach it on its level, it's an incredibly raw film. It is an incredibly emotionally honest film, and that's kind of interesting.
And there's always been speculation that it was a lot about himself. I believe Wood claimed that the inspiration for Glen or Glenda, which deals with at the time it was called transvestitism, now it would just be someone being transgender, was inspired by Christine Jorgensen, who became a socialite for a period of time and a celebrity. She was a former GI in World War II who realized she was transgender and transitioned.
And it was considered like a miracle of science at the time. So, again, these things don't always go straight upward.
Yeah. Oh, wait, you mean it didn't just started happening 10 years ago with trans people just popping out of nowhere?
Yes, it did.
And then, of course, you'd have films like Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. I mean, Tennessee Williams and queer content go together like bread and butter, in my opinion. But a lot of the queer content would be excised. One of the other movies I referenced, The Children's Hour, was based on a play where a majority of that queer content is excised as well. While the Hays Code was getting progressively weaker in the 50s, homosexuality was still a big taboo. And if it was discussed on the 1953 film Tea and Sympathy, the character isn't gay. It's more, oh no, I've been falsely accused of being gay. And like, oh, what a nightmare. And The Children's Hour, it's an interesting film because the character who is queer, or you could even argue queer-coded, Shirley MacLaine's character, is portrayed sympathetically. She's not this lesbian coming out to convert this nice chaste heterosexual girl. But at the end, she just takes her own life.
Mm-hmm.
So bury your gaze trope right there.
I wrote a fairly lengthy history of the bury your gaze trope at one point, and the core of it for lesbians, at least, is the desire by a audience to portray it because, I don't want to go into that, but also
this is a library.
Also at the time you couldn't have, there were exceptions. The Price of Salt's a really good example,
Mm-hmm.
but you weren't actually allowed to have happy endings. So there would always be this trope where you'd have the lesbian romance for the purposes of titillation, and then at the end one of them has to die, one of them has to go insane, or they have to go back to being
Mm-hmm.
straight.
Yeah, almost say you have to learn your lesson for your transgression.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As we get into the 60s, though, we have Andy Warhol, who you're probably familiar with him. Experimental films where he would have men kissing. He'd have a whole lot of biker leather guys.
Mm-hmm.
Then Italian directors like Pier Paolo Pasolini, director of makes me a little mad that Salo's his most famous movie, because he's also made a number of other great films like The Gospel According to St. Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
But he was someone who wore both his sexuality and his politics on his sleeve. The most interesting one I would say of this whole era is Midnight Cowboy, because there is this whole idea, and that quote of the meditation between on the borders between homosociality, which are close, intimate same-sex relationships that are not sexual or romantic, and homosexuality. Midnight Cowboy really plays that so close, because you watch it and you never really figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And the movie allows for the ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
And the man who directed that, John Schlesinger, is I don't know if he was out when he made it, but he was gay. Mm-hmm. So 3 movies I'd like to highlight from this era that I think are groundbreaking in a particular way. The first, as far as we know, was not made by anyone queer. I don't think Billy Wilder.
I think there's been some speculation that Marilyn Monroe was bisexual.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But I don't want to swear to that.
Yeah. So yeah, as far as we know, none of the 2 main actors, Jack Lemmon or Tony Curtis, but Some Like It Hot is a film that is hailed by both film historians and for a lot of queer people. They do kind of love it. I mean, the trope of a man disguising himself as a woman, that definitely has a lot of baggage to it, because the way it's always been is, oh no, they're doing it to trick innocent men. For Some Like It Hot, these are 2 down on their luck musicians who were like, we witnessed a crime, we need to get out of here as quick as possible. Oh hey,
mm-hmm.
This will get us out of here. And the way it plays with gender and expectation, one of my favorite scenes is when Jack Lemmon is talking to the other girls in the band, and he sees that they're all rowdier than he is.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just trying to kind of keep up the facade. It takes that, the other really, I would say, vicious stereotype of a transgender woman is it's a man dressing as a woman to invade a female space. And I think a scene like that absolutely decimates that idea. He's more just like, everyone get out of my room. And the probably is one of the most famous final lines in cinema history. Jack Lemmon's character in drag catches the eye of a millionaire and kind of decides like, maybe I can go with this. There's a great joke where Tony Curtis is like, why would a guy marry another guy? Jack Lemmon just says, well, I don't know, for security. But the end gives all these reasons why, Jack Lemmon gives all these reasons of why he can't marry the man, and just ends with, that's it, I'm a man. And there's just, nobody's perfect, which is so funny. And again, you think of it, 1953, and this actually was a movie that was made without the approval of the Hays Code. But considering movies through the 90s and even the 2000s would have that trope of, oh no, it's a man. Oh, like I've got to go throw up. That's disgusting. I have to take a shower. To see a movie in 1959, just treat that with nobody's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
It's one where I'm like, I absolutely see why it is beloved for a lot of people.
It is very much beloved among the queer community to this day. So maybe it's just because we all just really want to sleep with Marilyn Monroe.
Well, I mean, Personally, I like Tony Curtis.
Okay, there you go. Everyone's got someone in that movie.
Yeah. Jack Lemmon, I just want to like make him some tea.
He does need some tea in that movie.
Just some chamomile. But yeah, again, for 1959, groundbreaking film, and is still one of the funniest movies ever made. I rewatched it like in anticipation for this. God, still laughed out loud every time. The next one, I wouldn't say has as universal appeal, but if you are interested in terms of history, Scorpio Rising by Kenneth Anger is considered probably the first real entry in queer cinema. And Kenneth Anger, I think avant-garde is a good way to describe. I mean, I would describe him as he's not for everyone. I mean, this movie has Nazi imagery, Christian imagery, occult imagery, a lot of homoeroticism, and a lot of leather.
A lot of leather.
It's, again, and if you've ever been to a pride parade, you definitely see where some of the leather, although I think the leather stuff originated with Tom of Finland.
It did, yes.
We're getting into some real inside baseball here.
We are. We should probably dial it back.
Okay, and it was met with obscenity challenges. It's still cited as an inspiration by some filmmakers. So Jamie, would you recommend people see it, or would you kind of put this in the it's not for everyone category?
So the filmmaker that I remember referencing this film as one of his inspirations wasn't actually Nicholas Winding Refn. It was Gaspar Noé.
Oh, that's right.
And Gaspar Noé is a director, and I wouldn't make this comparison because it's the same way I feel about this film. I came out of one of his movies once, and someone asked me, "Was it good?" I was like, I don't know. Should I see it? Oh, yes. So I don't think you'll necessarily like Scorpio Rising, but if you are into avant-garde cinema, you do probably need to see it. If you're not into avant-garde cinema, then you should probably disregard everything I say about movies ever.
Alrighty, the third film is The Queen. So drag in 2021 has reached probably the most mainstream it's ever been. RuPaul, I mean, my opinion on RuPaul is she has a very, very limited idea of what drag is. But there is no denying that with that platform and with Drag Race has helped put drag into the mainstream, and I think make it seem a little bit less scary to people. But back in 1968, this was the first time drag was really in the mainstream in terms of a way of it being intentionally drag, not the way Some Like It Hot. So this was about a drag queen competition, more like a beauty pageant. And kind of, if you've ever watched Drag Race, it does have those moments where people talk about more gender, sex, they talk about race. There is a big argument at the end of the film about the queens of color feeling like they were slighted in favor of a white queen winning. And kind of that idea of this always happens to us. You saying
there were racial tensions in 1968?
Yeah, racial tensions in 1968. Who would have thunk? It kind of had a little bit of a resurgence. Number one, due to Netflix having it. I think a few people were like, "Oh, drag! I'll give this a watch." And Aja, who is a Drag Race alum, was on All Stars and was Crystal LaBeija. And I think a lot of people went and looked up Crystal LaBeja's reaction to losing. Great read line right here. I declare that she's one of the uglier people in the world. That's just such a flare insult. But again, kind of one of those, you go back and look, it's like this stuff has been here and been, people have been making movies about it a lot longer than we think. So we're going to move on to the 70s. So this is some like little history, culture backdrop. This is post Stonewall, post 1969. Once again, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson. And this was also, so queer people were as visible as they had been in decades, and they were demanding their rights. They were demanding a place in society. They were demanding visibility. They did not want to be in the closet anymore. Notably, in the politics realm, we had Harvey Milk, the first openly gay elected official in San Francisco, who was
immediately assassinated,
I think a year afterwards. And he was someone who was very confrontational. He had the idea of like, okay, let's try to boycott with our wallets. And he was also one of the people who said, like, look, the way we are going to win people, hearts and minds, is by coming out to our families. And at the same time this was happening, in what somewhat spurred it on was Anita Bryant, the orange juice lady, was on a very vicious campaign against gay rights. And once again, proving that everything old is new again, using the what about the children, using the they're trying to groom our children, save our kids, using that the same language that we still hear now in regards to queer people and in regards to them getting their rights. So it's a turbulent time, but a time where the community was like, we need to push forward. So in the film world, we had Boys in the Band. And that was an adaptation of a play. And rather than getting boulderized the way that Cat on a Hot Tin Roof or Children's Hour would, this was one where, directed by Rolling Friedkin, who wasn't gay, but was far more like, we're going to leave it out there as it is. John Schlesinger's follow-up, Sunday Bloody Sunday, comes out. 1972, John Waters, in my opinion, the greatest American. I love him.
She does.
I do. We share a birthday. His film Pink Flamingos comes out, and while I would definitely categorize Pink Flamingos as comedic exploitation, the fact that John Waters movies have always kind of embraced the little guy, embraced the freaks and the weirdos, he's become a queer, I mean, he's gay himself as well, but he's become a queer icon. 75, we have the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which, not everything ages completely well. There's some stuff I look at now and I'm a little like, but it is still like, you got to consider back in 1975, you might be like, oh, hey, I think I kind of get what this guy likes.
Yes.
Dog Day Afternoon, the Al Pacino film, a movie where I did not know this when I watched it. The reason he was robbing the bank was to pay for his girlfriend's gender reassignment surgery. And it's not portrayed as a joke in the movie. It's actually portrayed as a sympathetic reason. If anything, it makes him more humane. It's like, no, he's not crazy. He's trying to help the person he loves. And I have still not found this movie. I've wanted to, but word is out is 26 interviews, queer people, different genders, ages, races, trying to show the spectrum of the community. Comes out in 1977. And then, of course, outside the US, we have people like Werner Fassbinder making stuff like Fox and Friends, Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant. And we have probably, I would say, at this point in time in history, the most famous example of a queer film from outside the US. And that is La Cage aux Folles.
La Cage aux Folles. This is also the period where we start to see, oh man, his name dropped from my brain last time too. He did Jubilee and Blue.
Jubilee is great.
She's going to look up his name. And I just wanted to say that, like, one of the things you'll see as we go through this history, and as you go through the history of any marginalized group in any thing, is that whenever
Derek Jarman.
Yep. Whenever there's a push for rights for a marginalized group, they'll get some rights and then there'll be a major backlash, is what we saw in the 70s. I apologize if I go on about that too much. My degree is actually in political science, so with a specialty in human rights, so I tend to go on too much about that.
All right, so on to the 80s. So 80s is the 80s is overall a decade in film. I don't think it's the credit it deserves for being, I think, a lot more, especially in the early 80s, a lot more diverse than people think it is. There was a lot more variety. I think that's partially because we had a lot of the 70s runoff. And this is before the big studio system really became a thing again. Pedro Almodovar, one of our greatest living filmmakers. I mean that in 100% sincerity. He makes his debut in 1982. Fassbinder's final film, Carell, is released. Carell is not a movie I can recommend. I've seen a number of Fassbinder's movies. Carell I have not seen, because from everything I've heard, they're like, it's very frank and graphic.
It is pretty rough, yes. I did see it during film school.
That was one more, yeah, we did Fox and Friends. 1984, The Times of Harvey Milk, which is a documentary about the assassinated politician, comes out and kind of brings sort of a renewed interest in him and his contribution to the movement. And if you've ever seen this documentary, or Milk, which I think is it follows the documentary pretty well. Milk inspired a lot of other people who went on to work in the movement for years, most
Mhm.
notably Cleve Jones. We also see, on a more sad note, we're seeing more queer filmmakers make films, but we're also seeing in the mid-'80s the AIDS crisis being incorporated.
The AIDS crisis really did completely reset not just the way queer people view themselves, but also the way queer stories were told. I mentioned earlier that the bury your gays trope with women goes back to one, portray it, but not being able to give them happy endings. And the degree to which people associate queer stories with being tragic is so with gay men is so heavily based on the AIDS crisis. Like they were making movies about the AIDS crisis long before Reagan ever even acknowledged it was happening.
Yeah. Like Arthur for Buddies, I believe, that's the first feature film to deal with the AIDS. And Parting Glances, which I believe is Steve Buscemi's debut. Bill Sherwood, I believe, died very soon after the release of that film.
Buddies was released first, but Parting Glances was filmed in '82.
Oh.
So it was the first one made.
Okay. See, I go by release date. Some happier things. Donna Deitch's Desert Hearts. If you want if you want a lesbian romance that doesn't end sadly.
Well, first watch Carol, but
Desert Hearts is great. Also, one of my favorite character introductions in a film is the introduction of Kay trying to speed her car in reverse to keep up with a car going in the opposite direction. It's a great character establishing moment. We have the documentary stories from The Quilt. Torch Song Trilogy, which was an adaptation of Harvey Fierstein's play, comes out. I want to highlight Marlon Riggs, who is a groundbreaking documentarian. You've probably noticed up until now, most of the people we've been discussing are white. Marlon Riggs was a Black gay man who really put his experience and the experience of the men in his community out there. His film Tones on Tide featured activists, and it was Black men who were HIV positive and were queer, caught the ire of people like Jesse Helms, who then argued that the arts should be defunded.
Oddly enough, the two queer movies that they used to argue the art should be defunded were Tongues Untied and The Watermelon Woman, both Black movies.
Gee, I wonder why.
Interesting.
I mean, and that is, if I can reference a movie that we're going to talk about later, there is a great line in the film Paris is Burning where one of the interviewees says, my father said you have three things against you. You're Black, you're a man, and you're gay. And that did, especially in the 80s and 90s, make them even easier targets for people. But Marlon Riggs, actually, Criteria just released a box set of his documentaries, and I believe there are some that are free, available to watch online. He's someone I would absolutely recommend checking out. So in the mainstream, we just talked about queer creators, but we also started to see it portrayed in, by big studios. So we have Victorian Tootsie. Tootsie's another one of those where it's like, ooh, a man dressing as a woman to get an acting job made for a woman. Baggage. Victor Victoria, I think, of the two gender-bending movies in 1982 is definitely the stronger film, and I think it just holds up a little bit better.
It does. But I've never particularly liked Tootsie, but that's my opinion.
I mean, Tootsie has some great performances and great comedy, but it's just one where, again, no movie ages 100% well. And sometimes it's like you can look at it within the context of the time and go, probably progressive for its time, but also look at it in 2021 and just go, well, it just hasn't aged well. I can appreciate what it was doing. We also had gay characters in the mainstream. We had Personal Best with Meryl Hemingway, Kiss of the Spider Woman, My Beautiful Andrette. The Hunger, which is
a personal favorite of mine.
Just everyone looks pretty in The Hunger. Everyone's beautiful. David Bowie's beautiful. Catherine Deneuve's beautiful. Sid Sarandon's pretty.
Sid Sarandon is very pretty in that movie.
Actually, Ruby Rich, when she was writing about Desert Hearts, she said before this, the only, you couldn't really be a lesbian on film unless you were in The Hunger. The most interesting part of the mainstream queer portrayals of the 80s is World According to Garp for me. So that is John, based on a John Irving book. John Lithgow portrays Roberta Muldoon. Probably would not have been played by a man if it were made nowadays, but everything else about that character, I think, has aged very well, aside from the casting. Roberta is a former football player who transitioned, figured out who she was. She's in a community of women that absolutely accept her. They aren't saying, get out of here, you're invading our space. She's grounded, she's kind, she's someone that people go to. They trust her with their kids. And even when she dies in the book, no one misgenders her. They're just like, even the sportscasters talking about her, like, yep, she lived a great life. And that's something where I'm like, wow, that 100% holds up in 2021. Casting aside, but I'll just say credit to John Lithgow. John Lithgow 100% plays Roberta as a human being, he doesn't play her as a drag queen.
Not as a joke. Not as a joke.
I completely, I think, understands that character. And then just because I have to put a horror reference in, Nightmare on Elm Street 2, I put not explicitly queer. Jamie, you disagree with me.
I disagree with you, because it's one of those movies where once you get the metaphor, it becomes hilariously blunt. Although I told you could just put bit on there.
Well, we can talk about that when we're getting to 2020 and beyond.
See bit.
Oh, we will get there. So I can't talk about the 80s and queer cinema without talking about cruising.
You could.
It's an interest, it has its place in cinema history. If you are not old enough to remember the cruising controversy or have not heard of it, it was a film directed by William Friedkin. It is about a serial killer who's targeting gay men. Al Pacino plays a cop who goes undercover. And William Friedkin wanted to show a very frank depiction of late 70s gay subculture. He wanted to show cruising. He wanted to show the leather bars. But in the late 70s, queer people who were, again, just starting to get their rights, trying to convince people like we are not sexual deviants, were kind of concerned that this film would sensationalize that aspect or say this is all queer culture. And then journalist Arthur Bell, he wrote for the Village Voice. He was someone who specifically led for the calls of boycotts because he had been covering murders of gay men in the 70s that the police really did not work to solve. And he felt that this movie, it's like, you are really not, you're misrepresenting something.
You're not helping.
Yeah, you're not helping. However, I know older gay men who were like, I like cruising. I get that it's not all great. I get that there's some baggage with the making of it, but it kind of came down to what you said. It was nice to see something like that on screen.
There's this great quote. We're going to talk about a documentary called The Celluloid Closet in a moment. There's this excellent quote from a woman where she says that, like, you'll watch this total piece of trash movie because for like 5 minutes towards the middle, this woman dresses up in like a suit. And that's sort of prior to really very recently. You'll still see that. And frankly, to a certain degree, I'm sitting there going, man, this movie Ammonite isn't great, but she sure is into, not Natalie Portman. What is
Saoirse Ronan.
Saoirse Ronan, yeah. So you still get so little representation that you will put up with a lot more than you might with other kind of movies.
So moving on to the 90s, this is where new queer cinema happens. This is what B. Ruby Rich was talking about. So between 1990, or really more kind of like 89 into 95, we had queer filmmakers really break into the mainstream. So some of them, like Gus Van Sant, Gregg Araki, had made films in the 80s. The 90s is when they broke out and really got people, including like Sundance, to notice them. So we had Todd Haynes, Derek Jarman, Jenny Livingston, Tom Kalin, Gregg Araki. Debuts or breakthroughs. Gus Van Sant's big breakthrough was My Own Private Idaho.
Absolute classic.
Great film. Great Keanu Reeves performance. Actually, I saw one place where someone said, like, oh, are you afraid this is going to hurt your career to play like a gay, kind of a drifter? And he goes like, why would it hurt my career? I'm an actor. I'm not a politician. Gregg Araki has The Living End in the Doom generation, which I don't think Gregg Araki is for everybody. And I also think Mysterious Skin's his best movie. But again, if you really want to see queer cinema in the 90s, I think the Doom generation is a very good representation. We also had, for an Australian representation, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert in 1994, which was written by a gay man, and it's about 3 drag queens. going across Australia, though one of the characters is trans. Once again, a casting choice that probably would not be done now, played by a Terrence Stamp.
We'll talk about it when we get there.
We'll get there. And then, as Jamie mentioned, the celluloid closet. And if you look to your right, just notable films that came out, again, within the span of 2 years. Todd Haynes is one of my favorites, so I would say see anything he's made.
I'm really going to recommend Blue there, and I'm also going to recommend you look up Nothing About It before you watch it.
Okay. Blue is Derek Jarman. You did reference him before. I actually really liked Jubilee when you brought that. I was like, oh, that's right, he did direct Jubilee.
I love Jubilee. I also love his adaptation of The Tempest.
Yes. All right, so I would like now to talk about my favorite documentary. It's, I think, other than My Own Private Idaho, the movie that made the big splash of new queer cinema in terms of like really breaking through and finding mainstream success. So this was released, and that's Paris is Burning, directed by Jenny Livingston. It was released in 1990, but she filmed it over the course of 5 or I think 6 years total. She started it when she was a student at NYU, and it focused on the ball culture of New York City. So if you are a fan of the television series Pose, this movie is the basis for that series. So if you are a fan of Pose, you've not watched it, go find this film. Criterion just put out a fantastic re-release of it about a year ago.
Right now,
yeah, 4K restoration and everything. A lot of good interviews as well. And again, unlike other documentaries, this focused on queer people of color and a number of transgender women. I'm pretty sure for a lot of people watching this, this might have been the first time they'd ever seen an actual transgender woman interviewed. And it's both a celebration of ball culture, but it also shows you the realities of the life a lot of these people have to live. They are poor. They have been kicked out of their biological families. And the houses are the place where these people can find a family and also in many cases find safety. Mm-hmm. And there are characters that still, they do participate in sex work as a way to make money. Venus Extravaganza, who is interviewed a lot during this film, you find out towards the end that she was a sex worker, and her drag mother, Angie, is like, well, the police came to me with a photo and they're like, do you know her? It turns out she was murdered in a hotel room and no one found her until 4 days later. Mm-hmm. And you see her talking earlier about what she wants in her life. And she's just like, she doesn't want to be a martyr. She's like, well, I'd actually love to get married. I'd love to meet a man. I'd love to have a house in upstate New York. I'd love to adopt kids. Again, this doesn't sound like this creepy coming for your children caricature that queer people are painted as. But again, it also is a celebration, and it goes into why the people who participate in ball culture do so. For executive realness, there's this great quote from Pepper LaBeija, they're showing you, I could be an executive if you'd give me the chance. Because for a lot of the people who participate in ball culture, they know that the world of Wall Street, the world of high fashion, that is not a world that was made for them, and it's not a world that likely will be meant for them in their lifetime. But in the balls, this is where they can find their respect. This is where they can find freedom. And it really is just, you see people who are existing with joy in a world that at the time really didn't want them to exist at all. It's a beautiful documentary, but it's also sad.
Let them see it, Liz.
Okay, I'll stop selling it. I love it so much. Would you like to say anything about it? Or
I feel like I have nothing left to say.
I love it so much. So, wanted to take a quick detour to talk about lesbians on film, specifically in the 90s. So, Jamie, you did mention The Watermelon Woman, great film by Cheryl Dunye. this is where we started to see a lot of lesbians on film, and again, doesn't end in tragedy. And yes, Bound is there. I made sure.
Bound is an absolute classic. If any of you ever heard of a obscure little art house film called The Matrix, it's the film the Wachowski sisters directed before The Matrix. The Watermelon Woman is actually a very hard to track down movie these days.
It was on Amazon Prime for a little bit.
They did finally start to make it more available. It was actually used in Senate hearings because it got a grant from the National Endowment of the Arts to defund that program. I don't know if I've ever actually seen Go Fish. It too was very hard to track down. I do like high art a lot.
Watermelon Woman is interesting because I did watch it when it was on Prime. It's a film that explores the intersection of race, of sexuality, of cinema, of gender, and it's a really, again, I hope it becomes more available, because I think there are very few films that kind of talk about that, especially from the point of view of a Black woman. And it's also just a very well-made movie. And I think it's incredibly frustrating that Cheryl Dunye has not had an opportunity to really make another movie.
Kevin Smith gets to make 25 movies and she gets that one. Life, man.
Well, and then there's some like Single White Female, which, hinted queerness, not quite there, but
not quite there.
It's kind of there.
It's getting there. I think the lead character in Basic Instinct was bisexual.
Yeah, well, but that's kind of going back to like the
predatory aspect.
Yeah, which kind of brings us to our next slide.
Yeah.
So 1991, one of my favorite movies. I will put that out there. I love Silence of the Lambs. I think it is one of the best directed mainstream films I've ever seen. But Buffalo Bill is a queer-coded villain, and despite the fact that the film tries to say, but he's not that kind, it definitely isn't a great look. And a lot of queer audiences are just not happy with it.
Silence of the Lambs is frustrating because it is on a technical and like acting and writing level, just such a great film. But what's fascinating to me about it, and I think I said this during our previous one, is that Hannibal Lecter is only on screen for 15 minutes of that film. And he spends 2 of it explaining like, nope, Buffalo Bill is not actually trans. And there's actually like a 10-page subplot in the book version where the head of the FBI goes to a trans clinic and gets a lecture from one of the lead, from one of the women there that like, trans women aren't actually like this. We're not trying to, they don't hurt people. We're just trying to help these women. And it's interesting that they seem to both realize like we are messing up doing this, but neither of them ever seem to think maybe we could just not do it.
It is. It's one where like, I think there's a lot of good intentions there where the creators knew like, oh, we don't want people to associate with that, but
I mean, it's kind of unavoidable. There's a lot of baggage involving public perceptions of a famous serial killer called Ed Gein and the actual things that Ed Gein was thinking about that are completely mixed up and that ended up being one of the most influential. It ended up influencing Psycho, and Psycho is one of the most important films of all time. And that's where a lot of that stuff comes from.
Well, so one of the things I do have the Criterion edition of Silence of the Lambs, and let's say we do need to start.
Yeah, we need to rolling along. So
I knew this would happen. With
we did it again.
But so, they were talking about people protesting and handing out flyers of like, this film is, damaging to queer people. Jonathan Demme, they saw him reading it. And so I was like, John, you don't need to read that and pay attention. He goes, actually, maybe we do. And he did make Philadelphia afterwards, which was seen by many as like a penance. But Philadelphia in and of itself, and it was written by a gay man, is a movie that for the time when HIV was still very stigmatized, showing a gay man with HIV as incredibly sympathetic is, again, just groundbreaking.
Very groundbreaking.
And so same with The Birdcage, which I actually think overall, with a few exceptions, The Birdcage holds up.
We've
talked about it.
Liz's partner and I are actually doing parallel articles on The Birdcage, so we spend a lot of time talking about it. Yeah. So The Birdcage does and doesn't hold up, but it is an extraordinarily important movie for its moment, because unlike a lot of these films, it was an absolute box office smash.
Yeah, and my parents saw The Birdcage, and my parents are squares. And it's a movie that I'm assuming everyone's seen The Birdcage. even in 1996 showing like, oh, two gay men can successfully raise a child. And I don't remember the subplot of the fact that they had raised a kid being a big subject of ire. And this was a little bit before, Jerry Falwell was claiming Tinky Winky was making your kids gay. But just the idea of people going like, oh, I'll go see that. I can, and even saying like, I can relate to this. And also just an older gay couple, AIDS has nothing to do with it. They're just existing is something where after like a decade of the AIDS crisis is almost cathartic to see.
I mean, the Birdcage is a really great example of how much queer creators can bring to a movie, because obviously Nathan Lane is gay. And while he never officially came out, there have been people who've confirmed that the director of the Birdcage had a decades-long affair with a man.
Oh, Mike Nichols.
Yeah.
Yep.
So having those perspectives and making the film does actually really alter the way a story is approached, in my opinion.
Yeah. And it does have, I think, that great, we'll move on, everyone, we promise, that great line of just, it's a good Robin Williams performance too, where he just tells his son like, yes, I wear foundation. Yes, I live with a man. I'm a middle-aged gay man, but I'm not changing who I am for anybody. I'm like, that's such a, I think that was, and again, for a lot of queer people to see that, I'm like, I think they were like, oh, I feel seen. So quick look at two films from 1999. One was a hit and a big awards hit at the time. One kind of has lasted longer to become a queer classic, and that's Boys Don't Cry and But I'm a Cheerleader. I will say, just content warning, we are going to talk about, I should have said that for Paris is Burning as well, violence towards a queer person. So I'm very sorry. Boys Don't Cry is a dramatization of the case of Brandon Tina, who is a transgender man who was assaulted and murdered after acquaintances learned he was not cis. And there's But I'm a Cheerleader, which is very like pink pastel. It's a satire of conversion therapy of all things, but just of gender roles as a whole. Boys Don't Cry was the big award. It didn't win Best Picture, but Hilary Swank won an Oscar for playing Brandon Tina.
We'll get there.
Whereas But I'm a Cheerleader flies under the radar, although now if you were to ask any queer person what's the film you would rather watch, it's But I'm a Cheerleader.
I mean, that goes back to my problem with the bury your gays trope, which is that, we have a lot of stories about queer tragedy. So the ones that weren't about that are really the ones that I think people like me clung to prior to. Well, I'll let you know when that stops happening.
Aw. So the aughts. There were a lot of things that happened in the early aughts. So we had breakthroughs in films. We also had breakthroughs on TV, like Will and Grace. Again, that's a show. I've gone back and watched it. Some of it's still funny. Some of it's very woof. This is late 90s, but revolutionary in terms of gay people on TV. But in the aughts, there was more of a conservative backlash. Again, the aforementioned Jerry Falwell and Tinky Winkies are turning your kids gay. That led to a little bit of it in like 2000 into mid 2001. But I think the real reason it happened, I would point to two reasons. The first was 9/11, if you're going to ask how. If you remember post 9/11 films, there was I don't know if it was a social desire, I think partially it was, and studios thinking this is what people want to see, of your more traditional man's man back. Not that gay men can't be man's man or butch women can't be manly, but studios, big studios are always a little bit behind the times. So they're like, no, we need to go back to like action heroes. And the other is the rise of the global market, and that being really important for the box office. And there are a lot of countries, we'll talk about this a little later, where homosexuality is still even more taboo than it can be here. There's still some movies like Mulholland Drive, definitely a very
absolute classic.
Classic. John Cameron Mitchell, probably the biggest queer like breakthrough movie of the early aughts was Hedwig and the Angry Inch. We also had Jamie Babbitt, who made But I'm a Cheerleader. She made her follow-up film. Gregg Araki made probably, I would say, his most acclaimed movie, which I think is his best film, Mysterious Skin. In the latter aughts, we started to see queer stories kind of drift back into the mainstream. Some more interesting points. Brokeback Mountain comes out, garners acclaim, a little too risky for Best Picture at the Oscars. And then we have Transamerica, a depiction of a transgender woman, which again, not a joke, a very humane portrayal, played by a cis woman, but as Jamie keeps saying,
we'll get there.
And 2008, a movie that I think does absolutely hold up, Gus Van Sant's biopic of Harvey Milk. I'm not a fan of Sean Penn, but I gotta admit, he acts the heck out of that. And it is a movie that I think doesn't sanctify him. It does show that he could be a fairly stubborn guy, which he was in real life by all accounts.
He wasn't the best. I mean, no real person was the best dude ever.
Yeah.
Of the films on this list, I'm going to recommend Debs and You're Welcome, and I'm also going to recommend Mulholland Drive and Short Bus, and I'm Sorry.
Oh, hey, Hedwig's great.
Hedwig is great, but most people have seen Hedwig in my
Yes. So just a little queerness at the Oscars. So I mentioned Brokeback Mountain being too risky to win. So 2004, 2005, that movie comes out and is the favorite to win. And then this really awful film called Crash, not the really good one directed by David Cronenberg, but a bad one directed by I don't know who, ends up winning. And the overall like autopsy was like, what happened with people like, well, if we award the movie about gay people Best Picture, they're going to think we're out of touch. So let's award the film about race relations.
Just
which
give it good night and good luck. Just give it a good night and good luck, for God's sake.
Yeah, Crash is one of the worst movies to win the Oscar, in my opinion. But it is interesting, like how some things have shifted. 2005. Films about race relations are considered a lot less volatile than gay people, but 2004 was also like protect marriage.
Crash was an incredibly shallow film about race relations, but we're not talking about Crash.
But overall, queer stories at the Oscars, it's a good way for queer stories to be seen as legitimate, but oftentimes they're told by cis and straight creators, and the actors who play these characters are straight. So Tom Hanks in Philadelphia, Sean Penn in Milk, Jared Leto in Dallas Buyers Club.
We'll get there.
And again, playing gay or trans, it's seen as brave, but queer creators or queer actors seem to have a harder time getting nominated. But there's some films, I think All About My Mother by Pedro Almodovar is a great movie, features a transgender person playing a transgender character. And it's just a very wonderful and humane film.
I will also note from foreign films, I do want to give the Oscars a slight pass. You'll note that a lot of queer foreign films get nominated. Like, I don't even remember what movie Korea put up instead of The Handmaiden. But the thing is about foreign films, the country has to choose what film they're going to nominate rather than them just picking through. There have been some queer foreign films that have won. Fantastic Woman is a fantastic film.
And there have been like queer people behind the scenes who have won. Again, queer people have been in Hollywood pretty much since the beginning. And George Cukor, as I mentioned earlier, he's probably the first known queer director to get a nomination in 1932. And Jerome Robbins was the first out man to win Best Director. So now, Jamie, I'm going to let you take the wheel.
So one of the core issues with the way trans women are portrayed in media, and you'll note that we have The Crying Game on there, which is a film that I just can't stand, is that the way that trans women in specific, and trans people in general, are pathologized is we are considered to be either a man in a dress or a confused girl for whatever reason. So I got asked very recently, in fact, when I was talking about an episode of the X-Files spinoff that featured a trans woman that was played by a cis woman. And someone asked me like, well, would you rather have a trans woman played by a cis woman? I was like, no, I'd rather have it played by a trans woman. But the problem with having a trans character played by a cis man, if it's a trans woman, or a cis woman, if it's a trans man, is that it reinforces, however subtly, that idea that I'm not a woman, I'm just a man in a dress. And that is a problem that hasn't really gone away. It's been getting better. I mentioned Bit earlier, which is a movie about it's a movie about a group of vampires who only accept women, and they accept a trans woman who is played by a trans actress into their group. It's absolutely great. I recommend it. But on the other hand, Amazon was doing its kind of insincere, like, here are the queer things on Amazon Prime. And one of the things they brought up was Transparent, which has Jeffrey Tambor playing a trans woman. And it's just like, that problem hasn't gone away. And it really, and you can see it reinforcing this idea that trans people aren't the gender that we say we are. And so if you put a gun to my head and say you want a cis woman or a cis man playing a trans woman, I'm going to say a cis woman, because at least then you're acknowledging that we're women.
And I mean, I think I've noticed, so it's changed very like
Start and stop.
It's start and stop, but I think it is almost getting better, because a few years ago there was Scarlett Johansson was going to play a transgender man, and people said, please don't, and she actually said, okay, I won't do that.
Which is just an absolute miracle that Scarlett Johansson got told not to play something. She's like, okay.
Finally, at least she should have listened for Ghost in the Shell. All right, so on to the 2010s. This is where we're starting to see a lot more mainstream visibility and acceptance for queer people and trans people especially. Although from what I really think, trans people, the visibility came more on television.
It has.
Yeah, I mean, Laverne Cox deserves a trophy for just the amount of advocacy and educating she's done for people.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add except what you have on your slide. You know, we have a lot of really excellent films in this time period. I assume you've all seen Moonlight. If you haven't seen The Handmaiden, you need to see The Handmaiden. Carol, Portrait of a Lady on Fire.
Portrait of a Lady. Well, anything by Celine Sciamma should be seen, because she's an amazing director.
I cried for an hour after watching A Fantastic Woman. These are all great films. Just watch them all.
Love, Simon, I actually really wanted to point out. It's not, I think, a very good movie, but to see a teen movie about a gay kid, and it's not about like, oh God, I'm being bullied, or I want to hurt myself, or my parents won't accept me. Just, oh, I like a boy and I kind of don't know how to tell him. I'm like, oh, that's nice.
I mean, I said this about She-Ra a few weeks ago, that one of the things that I found so valuable, and a lot of these are getting there more, which are extremely valuable, is that queer stories tend to have queerness as their central focus, you know, coming out, discrimination, bullying. And it is extremely refreshing to see movies where, like, or TV shows in the case of She-Ra, where, like, yes, the main character falls in love with a girl. Spoilers for She-Ra, I guess. But it's never like a thing. They never bring it up.
Well, that's why I like Tangerine, which is directed by Sean Baker, who directed one of my favorite movies of the 2010s,
The Florida Project.
Florida
Project's great.
Tangerine is about it starts two transgender women, and they're just trying to track down people. It's kind of a day in the life, and there are instances where their identity factors into it, and other times not at all. But Tangerine's a lot of fun. I think that might still be on Netflix, or it might be on Hulu. I mean, check your local streaming service. It's Pride Month for at least a few more days.
They do like to pretend that they like us during Pride Month, companies.
I would like to just take a quick moment to highlight Black queer lives. So as I kind of mentioned before, majority of the queer stories that have really gotten a chance to be told have been white and usually cis. And that has to do more with the fact that in terms of Hollywood, the people who get more of a chance to tell their stories are white. Again, it's slowly getting better, but still a lot of work needs to be done. But there, you know, in the past, people like Jenny Livingston, who was white, you know, she made Paris is Burning. And there was actually some critique, because they're like, well, at the end of the day, you're kind of monetizing the lives of people. You know, you're someone who has a little bit more privilege than, and she is more economically privileged than they are. She's still a member of the queer community, but it's like this idea of like, are you telling their stories, or are you letting them tell their own stories? And I think Livingston is very conscious of that. If you watch Paris is Burning, she's just not in it at all. She is just letting the camera roll. So I think there is a way to, if you're gonna do that, give someone else a platform. There's a way to do it right. Marlon Riggs, and also Isaac Julian with Looking for Langston. And since the aughts, there's been a boom of Black queer content and Black queer creators. Probably the two most notable ones, Pariah by Dee Reese, and Moonlight. And there have also been smaller films like Happy Birthday Marsha and The Shakedown that specifically highlight Black queer women. I would say if you haven't seen Moonlight, Pariah, absolutely do so. And I would once again try to look up the work of Marlon Riggs. So we're getting to the end.
We're only 15 minutes over.
Hey, I said a minute 10. We're technically 2 minutes over.
Okay.
Or an hour 10. 2008, another sort of compare and contrast. So 2 films about conversion therapy camps came out that year. Have you seen either of these movies?
I saw Boy Erased.
Oh, so I've seen Cameron Post and Boy Erased. So this is why I found they were interesting films for a number of reasons. So Boy Erased is based on a true story by Jared Conley. He was sent to a conversion camp by his fundamentalist parents in the early aughts, and had a fairly traumatic experience both there and even before he went. And then there's Cameron Post. It's based on a young adult novel, and it's about a girl who's sent away in the 90s. Her parents are, I believe, they passed away. Her aunt is raising, and her aunt kind of is a little fundy. And it's interesting how they both deal with it. Boy Erased is definitely portraying the very like traumatic end. Cameron Post is more, the character is very passive. I can forgive that because it's the 90s and it's like, well, you know, how would she kind of know anything otherwise? But she very quickly hooks up, like kind of meets up with 2 other kids in the camp who are like, oh, you know, this is all nonsense, right? And just the end of the movie, they decide we're going to go for a hike and just not come back. We're going to hitchhike and find someone to drive us somewhere. But what's really interesting about it is Boy Erased is directed by Joel Edgerton, who is, as far as we know, straight. Cameron Post is directed by Desiree Akhavanch, who is bisexual. And the fact that Boy Erased had more money, had bigger stars, had more of an awards push, it did kind of spark a conversation of, again, who gets to tell these stories? And kind of the idea of how come the queer story that had more money and push behind it was the one at the end of the day told by someone who wasn't in the community. And honestly, I got to say, if Joel Edgerton wants to tell the story, good on him. But it's kind of like in 2018, it's like, can you just be a producer and find someone to direct? It's not even a poorly directed movie.
No.
Just, you know, the conversation of,
call me Joel.
you know, who gets the opportunities. So we're bound at 2020 and beyond. A sad reality is with the global box office and with China specifically being a very important country to make money in, queer characters are probably not going to be in big mainstream films, or at least if they are going to be in ways that can be easily edited out. Thor Ragnarok was one we were discussing the other day. Of Tessa Thompson's character was originally supposed to be involved with one of the other Valkyries. She was supposed to say "my lover,"
and they cut the line.
Disney cut it, and they're like they didn't want to tick off a major money making country. So it's kind of going back to the indie circuit as it kind of was in the 90s and the early aughts. But on better news, TV is where we're really starting to see this representation. So as I said, Pose is a great example, although there have been a lot of queer people who've said like, okay, what's going to happen when Pose is gone? Are we ever going to see another Pose? Probably not. And are these actors going to get the same opportunities? Although MJ Rodriguez was in a production of Little Shop of Horrors as Audrey, and I saw her sing Suddenly Seymour and started crying because she's so good. But you also have stuff like Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, you know, queer actors playing queer characters. Queen Sugar has a transgender man playing a trans, and actually I believe wrote it into the character and said, well, why don't we acknowledge it? So it's not a complete loss. Patty Harrison, who's a transgender actor, she's the lead in a film that came out this year, Together. But the role she's playing is a cis woman who becomes a surrogate for it's not Ed Helms. Is it Ed Helms?
I haven't watched it.
Jason Sudeikis, maybe?
I'm telling you, I haven't watched it.
It's one of the two. They kind of look alike to me. And that's one where I could see people going, well, okay, why is it not okay for a, you know, a cisgender man to play a trans woman, but a transgender woman can play a cisgender woman? But can you explain why the playing field's a little different?
Because if you're a trans actress, which I guess I technically am, aren't I? You don't get a lot of opportunities if you only play trans roles. So whereas if you're a cis woman, you have all the opportunities, and the same goes for trans men and cis men. So, you know, if you are a cis woman and you take a trans woman role, you are taking away one of the tiny handful of roles that trans women are especially suited for. Whereas, you know, if you're a trans woman taking a cis woman's role, you know, you could a cis woman could go find another role
Mhm.
20 minutes later.
Yeah. Well, and if like in a perfect world, it would just be like everyone is cast according to ability.
And in a perfect world, but let me know when we get there.
Yeah. I think probably a really good example, as you were saying, of queer stories like not centering trauma and not is Monsoon, which stars Henry Golding, as I like to call him, Mr. Handsome. And this is a film where his sexuality is just a part of who he is. It is not central to the story. It partially is because he's meeting up with someone he'd been conversing with, but the main drive of the story is he's going back to Vietnam, which he left at 6 years old, and trying to reconnect with that. And I'm like, wow, to see a story where someone's queerness is not, number one, the driving part of the story, and number two, a source of angst. I'm like, it would be really great if this is just where we could go from here.
I would also like to shout out a film called Shiva Baby.
I have not seen that yet.
It is a fantastic film in which the main character is bisexual, and her varying relationship with both a man and a woman is central to the story, but it's not really that much of a focus. It is, however, a horror film. No, I will not explain until you've seen it. Once you've seen it, you'll know I'm right.
I did not know that.
It's not really a horror film. The joke
All right.
is.
Okay. And I would just like to give a quick shout out to some books. The Celluloid Closet, New Queer Cinema, written by Ruby Ridge, Queer Images, which I referenced a lot for this. There are also a number of good essays. Criterion.com, one of the things they have where even if you can't buy the films, you can always read the essays that come with the Blu-rays. So for their films like Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Times of Harvey Milk,
La Cage aux Folles.
La Cage aux Folles, Desert Hearts, you can read all of those there for free. There's no cost, and just great queer directors to look for.
Questions, comments, criticisms?
All right, I'm gonna stop screen sharing. All right, we're back.
What questions do we have?
All right, okay, I'm just trying to look through a few. So a couple of people saying love that movie. What is ball culture? I really want to explain this in a way where it's not.
Seen Pose? It's Pose.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I want to explain it succinctly. So ball culture kind of came out of its underground, usually people of color. There's a couple of, where it all came from is a number of different places. Some of it came because it was a lot of Black queer people, came from the church where people would kind of, would yell, would celebrate. But specifically, people would go, they would have categories. Some of it was military. There's one for like military realness, executive realness. It's kind of how well you can play this part. I'm really bad at explaining this. I'm very sorry.
It's like, if you can imagine, I'm going to compare it to two TV shows that I don't really watch, but I think it's if you can imagine a mix of RuPaul's Drag Race and Soul Train.
You know what? I think that's a good descriptor.
Thank you.
Someone did say, someone, Shiva Baby gave me so much anxiety.
Sure.
Oh, what about Making Love? The first gay film from a major studio, I believe.
I've not seen that one. I can't swear to that, frankly. I don't know what year it came out off the top of my head. I can Google it, while I'm sitting right here. You answer other questions while I Google.
Yeah, a lot of this was kind of hard to pull a timeline together. What was the other? Jennifer's Body. What's my opinion on Jennifer's Body? Well, I think Jennifer's Body is a number one underrated horror classic. Jennifer's Body is a film that I don't know if I would consider it to be explicitly queer, but it definitely has queer undertones. Like there's a kind of, I would almost say the way Single White Female is, where it's not overt, but there's enough there where you can really read into it. I do love Jennifer's Body, though. That is a great movie. Someone recommended Rafiki for Black queer movies. That is good as well.
So Making Love is from 1982, and I do believe that Boys in the Band predates that. So I don't know which one of them was from a major studio.
I think Boys in the Band might have been.
MGM?
Yeah, because 70s, they were starting to kind of take more risks with that. And it's, like that. again, thank you for bringing it up, because I did notice like that was completely, now that you mentioned it, like completely absent in my PowerPoint. So I apologize. I'm trying to see any more.
I didn't see any other questions. If you have any other questions, now's the time.
Yeah, I did like that someone was very, what I think but yeah, anyone else? We hope that we gave you a good overview. Again, I would definitely recommend looking up some of the books that I mentioned. B. Ruby Rich's writings is she's a really good source on this. Queer Images, although I think it came out in like the early aughts, I think it is still a really good rundown on a lot of like the earlier parts of queer cinema, or just queerness in cinema. Alrighty, I think with that,
I think
we
we're done.
are all set. Sue,
take it away.
Yep.
Hi, thank you. So before everyone goes, I just want to give out the code for attending this program. If you are participating in the Manchester City Library Adult Summer Reading Program, I'm going to throw up a screen share with the code on it. You can go into Read Squared and enter the code TOUCAN, TOUCAN, and get 60 points for attending this program. On behalf of the Manchester City Library, thank you so much for attending, and have a great evening.
It is evening.
Have a good night. Thank you for listening to us.